I am Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso. The studio lights that day were hotter than I expected. In the moment waiting for the cameras to turn on, I could clearly hear my own breathing. Outside, my country was suffering every day quiet pains that never appear on the news. Inside, everything was clean, safe, and carefully prepared. It was the first major gathering of Africa in the year 2026. I was invited onto national television to speak about the future, stability, and peace. The producers were very clear: speak about the economy, security, and unity. Do not speak about religion, do not speak about God. At that time, Burkina Faso and the entire Sahel region were deeply fractured. Violence had become familiar. Many young people were not only hungry for food, but also hungry for meaning, and so they were drawn toward extremism because it gave them an identity that society had failed to provide. Corruption drained trust, poverty destroyed hope, and injustice taught people to expect nothing better. Faith had once been a shared foundation of society, but it had been pushed into private corners. It was called sensitive, divisive, and therefore something better left unspoken. But standing in front of the cameras, I realized one thing. Our greatest crisis is not economic or political, but spiritual. The human soul is being suffocated by fear and hatred. Life itself has become cheap. A society can endure bad policies, but it cannot survive when conscience dies. I began by following the script, speaking about security and development, but every word felt incomplete, like describing a body while forgetting the heart. Then I stopped. I said what I was not allowed to say. I said, Africa does not belong to the devil. Africa belongs to Christ. I did not say this to provoke. I did not say it to attack Islam or any other faith. I said it because silence at that moment would have been a lie. And a leader who fears truth more than backlash has already surrendered. Within a few hours, threats and warnings appeared. Some came from enemies I expected. Others came from respected voices who believe that peace can only be preserved by keeping the soul silent. So I ask you, those who believe in Jesus, who believe in morality, who believe in leadership with conscience, why would a single sentence spoken on television cause such fear if it did not touch the very center of the crisis we are truly facing? I did not name people as enemies. I did not point at any tribe, any mosque, any church, any community, or any nation. I have buried too many citizens to allow myself that kind of laziness. When blood has soaked the same ground for decades, the simplest lie is to say that the problem has a human face. It does not. I am a soldier by formation, and soldiers are taught early that naming the wrong enemy is fatal. If you fire at the wrong target, you only multiply the dead without ever ending the war. In Burkina Faso, Muslims and Christians have lived side by side for generations. They share markets, schools, marriages, and graves. When violence erupts, it does not ask for baptismal records or prayer schedules. It feeds on fear, not faith. When I spoke, I was careful, even if my words sounded blunt. I said the enemy is not people. The enemy is the darkness that convinces people they are nothing, that their lives have no meaning, that killing is justified because hope has disappeared. That darkness whispers lies that sound practical and urgent. It says survival has no morals. It says power excuses cruelty. It says God is absent, or worse, indifferent. I have seen what happens when leaders point at human enemies. Entire regions collapse under that weight. In the Sahel alone, millions have been displaced not because of drought alone, but because neighbors were taught to fear neighbors. When you tell a young man that his suffering has a human target, you give him permission to destroy. When you tell him the enemy is a people, you give him an identity built on hatred. I refuse that language. Not because it is politically convenient, but because it is morally false. Hatred is never born in a vacuum. It is cultivated slowly, watered by injustice, fertilized by humiliation, and harvested by those who profit from chaos. If I had blamed a religion or an ethnicity, I would have been repeating the same crime with a different accent. This is why my words unsettled some audiences. They expected accusation. They expected division. They expected me to name a visible enemy so they could organize around fear. Instead, I named something invisible, something far more threatening to systems built on control. I named darkness itself. Darkness cannot be negotiated with. It cannot be appeased. It can only be confronted by light, and light requires courage, humility, and truth. That truth begins with refusing to dehumanize one another, even when pain tempts us to do so. I speak now to Muslims and Christians alike. If I call a human being your enemy, I have failed you. If I teach you to hate your neighbor, I have betrayed my office. My duty is not to simplify evil, but to expose it. This understanding shaped everything that followed, including how I chose my words and how I accepted the consequences. When I used the word devil, I knew exactly what many would hear, and I knew exactly what I meant. These are not always the same thing. Too often, we hide behind symbols and forget realities. Too often, we argue about words so we can avoid confronting the truth they point to. I was not speaking of superstition. I was not invoking folklore or trying to frighten children. I was naming a condition of the human heart when it abandons conscience. In my experience, the most dangerous evils do not wear horns. They wear suits, uniforms, slogans, and sometimes even humanitarian language. When I said devil, I was speaking of despair that convinces a young man his life is already over before it begins. I was speaking of corruption that teaches leaders to sleep peacefully while children starve. I was speaking of violence that becomes routine, justified, and eventually invisible. I was speaking of hatred that is taught so skillfully that people believe it is their own idea. In Burkina Faso, I have watched villages emptied not only by bullets but by hopelessness. I have seen schools closed not only by attacks, but by the belief that education no longer matters. When despair rules, people stop asking whether something is right. They only ask whether it is effective. That is when the soul has been conquered. Corruption is not merely theft of money, it is theft of trust. It tells the poor that honesty is foolish and that justice is for sale. When corruption becomes normal, violence soon follows, because nothing restrains power anymore. Numbers can explain this. Billions of dollars leave Africa every year through illicit financial flows, while communities lack clinics, clean water, and security. But numbers alone cannot explain the spiritual damage of watching leaders enrich themselves while preaching patience to the poor. Violence, when sustained, reshapes morality. At first killing shocks, then it becomes necessary, then it becomes justified, finally it becomes forgotten. This is the devil I was naming. A condition where human life loses its sacred weight, where the death of a stranger no longer interrupts dinner. Hatred is perhaps the most efficient weapon of all. It requires no ammunition. It only requires stories. Stories that say your suffering has a face. Stories that say mercy is weakness. Stories that say revenge is justice. Once these stories take root, even ordinary people can be persuaded to do extraordinary harm. Worst of all is indifference. The quiet acceptance of death as background noise, the ability to scroll past suffering without pause. Indifference is the final victory of darkness because it convinces good people they are powerless. When faith disappears from public life, these forces rush in to fill the vacuum. Not because religion is perfect, but because conscience needs an anchor beyond convenience. When there is no higher authority than power, power becomes God. This is why my words frightened some. I was not attacking beliefs. I was threatening a system that survives by numbing the soul. Naming these realities removes their camouflage. I believe Jesus Christ stands as the opposite of this darkness. Not as a political symbol, but as a moral axis. His life insists that every human being has infinite value, even when the world says otherwise. That belief is dangerous to despair, to corruption, and to violence. Understanding this definition is essential, because without it, my sentence will always be misunderstood. With it, the sentence becomes a mirror. After that moment, after the explanations and the outrage, I had to ask myself a harder question. Why did I feel compelled to speak not only against darkness, but for something specific, something named, something rooted? The answer lies in how I understand Africa itself. Africa has been described to the world using the language of wounds, war zones, failed states, poverty statistics, endless crises. When you hear a story repeated long enough, it begins to feel like destiny. Many Africans have grown up believing that suffering is our natural condition, that instability is our inheritance, that violence is written into our identity. I reject that with every fiber of my being. When I said Africa belongs to Christ, I was not making a claim of ownership in the political sense. I was declaring a spiritual origin. I was saying that this continent was not conceived in hatred, nor designed for endless bloodshed. Africa was not born to be a laboratory for conflict or a warehouse of despair. Africa was created for life. I have traveled across our land, from villages with no electricity to cities struggling under the weight of rapid growth. I have met mothers who pray before feeding their children, not because food is abundant, but because faith is all they have left. I have met imams and priests who risk their lives to keep their communities from tearing each other apart. These people are not shaped by violence, they are shaped by hope under pressure. The idea that Africa is naturally violent is a lie repeated so often that it has become invisible. History tells a different story. Long before modern borders, African societies built systems of mediation, reconciliation, and shared responsibility. Community mattered, elders mattered, the sacred mattered, even conflict was bounded by moral rules. Colonialism, exploitation, and proxy wars disrupted these moral ecosystems. They replace local accountability with distant power. They train generations to associate authority with force rather than service. Yet even under these pressures, faith survived, not as an ornament, but as a source of dignity. When I speak of Christ, I speak of that dignity made explicit. I speak of a vision where the poor are not disposable, where the weak are not forgotten, where forgiveness interrupts cycles of revenge. This is not foreign to Africa. It resonates deeply with our ancestral understanding that life is sacred because it is given, not owned. Some ask me why I did not speak in more neutral terms. Why not say Africa belongs to humanity, or to peace, or to shared values? My answer is simple. Neutral language often hides moral emptiness. It soothes ears without strengthening hearts. In times of crisis, people do not need abstractions, they need an anchor. For me, Christ represents that anchor, not as a weapon against others, but as a declaration that Africa's story is not finished in tragedy, that our identity is not violence, that our future is not cursed. To Muslims, I say this with respect and clarity. I am not erasing you, I am not denying your faith, I am naming the moral foundation that guides my conscience as a leader. We share more than divides us, including the belief that life is sacred and that injustice offends God. Declaring a spiritual identity is an act of resistance against despair. It tells our children they were not born for chaos. It tells our leaders they are accountable to more than polls and power. It tells the world that Africa's wounds do not define its soul. This conviction did not make my path easier, it made it clearer. Clarity has a cost. Once you see what truly governs a society, you can no longer pretend that fear is neutral. Fear is never neutral. It is a tool, and like all tools, it serves whoever knows how to wield it. I have learned that a society ruled by fear is easy to manage. When people believe they are weak, they accept humiliation. When they believe the future is closed, they settle for crumbs. When they believe violence is inevitable, they stop resisting it. Fear shrinks the human horizon until survival becomes the only moral category left. In the Sahel, fear has many faces. Fear of attack, fear of hunger, fear of speaking honestly, fear of trusting one another, fear of tomorrow. When fear accumulates, it becomes a climate, not a moment. People begin to make decisions they would once have found unthinkable, simply because fear whispers that there is no alternative. I have watched communities comply with injustice not because they believed it was right, but because they believed resistance was useless. I have seen young people join violent groups not out of hatred, but out of despair. Fear convinces them that dignity can only be reclaimed through force. This is why faith matters, not as decoration, not as ritual, but as resistance. Faith reminds a person that fear does not have the final word. It says your value does not depend on your power. It says your life is not an accident. It says you are seen, even when the world looks away. When I placed faith above fear in that moment on television, I was speaking first to my own heart. Leadership tempts you to calculate everything, to weigh words against consequences, to measure truth by its cost. There is wisdom in prudence, but there is also cowardice disguised as strategy. I asked myself a simple question. If I am afraid to name what gives people hope, then what kind of leader am I? If I allow fear to decide my language, then fear already governs my office. Jesus speaks often of fear, not to shame it, but to confront it. He tells his followers not to be afraid, not because danger disappears, but because fear distorts judgment. Faith does not deny suffering. It refuses to let suffering define meaning. I wanted my people to remember that they were not born to bow endlessly before terror, that they were not created to live as permanent victims of history, that their worth does not rise or fall with the strength of armed groups or the attention of the international community. A people who believe they have dignity are harder to manipulate. A people who believe their lives matter are less likely to accept narratives that justify their destruction. This is why fear reacts so violently when faith speaks. Faith exposes fear as temporary. I know some leaders prefer fear because it produces obedience. I do not. Obedience without conscience is fragile. It collapses the moment fear finds a stronger master. Only faith rooted in dignity produces resilience. By speaking as I did, I removed fear's monopoly on the story. I reminded people that courage is not the absence of danger, but the refusal to let danger become God. This choice reshaped how violence itself could be understood, and ultimately, how it could begin to lose its false legitimacy. Violence survives on permission. Not only weapons, not only funding, but permission granted through language. Every act of violence arrives carrying a story that explains why it was necessary, why it was justified, why it was inevitable. Remove the story, and violence begins to look naked, crude, and indefensible. I understood this long before that broadcast, but I felt it with new urgency afterward. In the Sahel, Violence feeds on narratives that turn suffering into a license to kill. Narratives that say revenge restores honor. Narratives that say blood answers blood. Narratives that say some lives matter less because they belong to the wrong group, the wrong belief, the wrong village. When I said the enemy is not human, I did something very simple and very dangerous. I removed violence's moral excuse. If no human being is the enemy, then no human death can be celebrated. If darkness is the enemy, then killing your neighbor does not defeat it. It serves it. This is why the statement unsettled extremists of every kind. Their power depends on turning people into symbols. Once a person becomes a symbol, their death feels abstract. Once death feels abstract, conscience goes quiet. I refuse to speak in symbols. I spoke in moral terms. I have studied conflict data, not as an academic exercise, but as a matter of survival. In regions where leaders and religious figures publicly reject dehumanizing language, cycles of retaliatory violence slow. Where hate speech is normalized, killings multiply. This is not theory, it is measurable. Words either shorten wars or prolong them. When violence loses its narrative of righteousness, it becomes harder to recruit. A young man asked to kill must believe his victim deserves it. If he is told instead that the real enemy is despair, corruption, and hatred, his weapon begins to feel absurd in his hands. This is how violence starts to starve. I did not expect armed groups to applaud me. I did expect ordinary people to pause, and many did. I received messages from mothers, teachers, and elders who said the same thing in different words. They said, for the first time, someone told us we do not have to hate in order to survive. Breaking the logic of violence does not end violence overnight. Nothing so deeply rooted disappears quickly, but it removes its oxygen. It interrupts the rhythm of retaliation. It introduces doubt where certainty once justified killing. I speak here also to the international community. Policies that ignore the moral narratives of conflict often fail. Weapons can suppress symptoms. Aid can ease suffering. But only moral clarity dissolves justification. Without it, violence simply waits. By refusing to grant violence a human target, I forced it into the light. I made it explain itself without excuses. Violence exposed like this always appears smaller, weaker, and more desperate than it pretends to be. This is why words matter, not as slogans, but as moral architecture. They determine what a society believes it is allowed to do. After that, the question was no longer about violence alone. It became a question of authority. Who in the end do we answer to? What voice is higher than pressure, higher than fear, higher than consequence? When I spoke the name of Christ on national television, I was not making a theological argument. I was making a moral declaration. I was saying that there exists an authority above presidents, above generals, above donors, above media narratives, and above my own survival instincts. That authority is not negotiated. It is not revised by circumstance. It is not silenced by convenience. Every leader learns quickly how compromise works. You are told which truths are acceptable and which are dangerous. You are told which words calm markets and which unsettle allies. You are taught the art of saying enough to appear sincere, but not enough to disrupt power. Over time, compromise begins to feel like wisdom. But there is a moment when compromise crosses into betrayal, not of ideology, but of conscience. I felt that line clearly that night. I knew that avoiding the name of Christ would protect me. I also knew it would cost something far more serious than political capital. Christ, for me, represents a conscience that cannot be bought, a judgment that does not bend to force, a reminder that power exists to serve life, not dominate it. When I placed Christ above compromise, I was not elevating myself. I was placing myself under judgment. This unsettled those who are comfortable managing fear. Systems built on control rely on silence around ultimate truths. They tolerate faith as long as it remains private, ritualized, and harmless. The moment faith speaks publicly about dignity, accountability, and the sacredness of life, it becomes inconvenient. I was warned, sometimes gently, sometimes bluntly. I was told that religion complicates diplomacy, that it alienates partners, that it introduces instability. I listened. Then I asked myself another hard question. What kind of stability requires silence about conscience? What kind of diplomacy survives only if the soul is absent? I speak now directly to leaders in the Sahel and beyond. We negotiate borders, security arrangements, and economic frameworks, but rarely do we negotiate with our own conscience. We convince ourselves that survival excuses everything, that silence is neutrality, that moral clarity is a luxury. Christ does not allow that comfort. He does not bless every arrangement simply because it is practical. He asks who is protected and who is sacrificed. He asks who benefits and who disappears quietly. That is why invoking his name is disruptive. It reintroduces questions power prefers to forget. I did not invoke Christ to exclude Muslims. I did it to state clearly that my leadership is bound by a moral ceiling, that there are things I cannot trade away, even if pressured. That human life is not a bargaining chip. That truth is not a strategy. In a world of calculated ambiguity, naming Christ is an act of clarity. It says there is a line I will not cross, even if crossing it would make my life easier. That line frightens those who depend on limitless compromise. I know the risks, I live with them. But I also know that a leader who survives by abandoning conscience eventually governs nothing but ruins. Authority without moral grounding corrodes from within. Placing Christ above compromise was not a political move, it was a confession, a declaration of who I am accountable to when no one is watching. And once that declaration is made, silence itself becomes impossible. There are silences that are written into law, and there are silences that never need to be written because everyone understands them. These are the most powerful silences of all. They are enforced not by police, but by fear of consequence, by habit, by the quiet agreement that some truths are better left untouched. Before that broadcast, I had already learned where those invisible lines were. You can speak about development as long as you do not ask who profits from underdevelopment. You can speak about security as long as you do not ask why violence keeps returning. You can speak about unity as long as you do not speak about the moral emptiness that fractures it. And you can speak about faith as long as you keep it safely sealed inside private buildings, churches, mosques, homes. As long as faith does not step into public conscience, it is tolerated. The moment it does, it is labeled dangerous. That is the silence I broke. I did not break it dramatically, I did not shout, I did not accuse, I simply spoke a sentence that acknowledged what many feel but are trained not to say aloud, that Africa's crisis is not only external, that it is not only about weapons or money, that it is also about the removal of the sacred from our shared moral language. Breaking an accepted silence does not always cause immediate chaos. Sometimes it causes something more unsettling: stillness. People pause. They realize they have been holding their breath for a long time. Silence enforced by fear collapses when someone names it. I was accused of destabilizing discourse, of introducing religion into politics, of threatening coexistence. Yet the coexistence we are often offered is thin and fragile. It asks believers to amputate their conscience at the door of public life. It calls that peace. I believe true peace is thicker. It allows conviction without violence. It allows faith without domination. It allows moral speech without coercion. Silence that requires self-denial is not peace. It is repression wearing polite language. When I spoke, I did not demand that others believe what I believe. I demanded only the right to speak honestly about what governs my decisions. If a leader cannot name his moral foundation, then his authority rests on nothing but force and image. I know many religious leaders who have learned to survive by silence. I do not judge them. Survival teaches caution. But leadership demands more than survival. It demands witness. Not the witness of perfection, but the witness of truth spoken without hatred. To Christians, I say this gently: faith that never leaves private space eventually loses public courage. To Muslims, I say this with equal respect: conscience must not be confined to ritual alone. To all leaders, I say this plainly: if you accept silence where moral truth should speak, you teach your people to lie politely. Breaking silence is uncomfortable because it removes plausible deniability. Once truth is spoken, choices become visible, responsibility sharpens. That is why silence is defended so fiercely by systems that prefer ambiguity. I broke that silence not because I enjoy conflict, but because silence had become complicit. When injustice thrives, silence is never neutral. It sides with whatever is already powerful. I do not ask applause for this, I ask reflection. Ask yourself what you have learned not to say. Ask yourself who benefits from that silence. Ask yourself what it costs your soul to maintain it. Only then can we speak of peace that is not built on fear. By the time the noise settled, I understood that words alone are never the end of responsibility. They are the beginning. If Africa belongs to Christ, then that claim cannot remain symbolic. It must shape how we live, how we govern, how we protect life, and how we imagine the future. Faith that does not change behavior is sentiment. I did not speak to decorate speeches. I spoke to impose a burden on myself first. To belong to Christ means we must live differently, especially those of us entrusted with power. It means we must refuse shortcuts that destroy dignity. It means we must measure success not only by growth, but by whether the weakest are safer than before. If Africa belongs to Christ, then corruption is not cleverness, it is sin. It is theft from children who will never know what was stolen from them. It is betrayal disguised as intelligence. No amount of geopolitical pressure can excuse it. No emergency can sanctify it. If Africa belongs to Christ, then violence loses its romance. Killing cannot be heroic. Revenge cannot be justice. Security cannot be built on terror. The sanctity of life becomes non-negotiable, even when it is inconvenient. Especially when it is inconvenient. If Africa belongs to Christ, then leadership becomes service again. Not performance, not dominance, service. The leader bends first. The leader listens first. The leader carries blame before assigning it. This is not weakness, it is moral strength. I know how unrealistic this sounds to some. I know the arguments. The world is harsh. Enemies are ruthless. Survival requires compromise. I hear these words every day. But I have also seen what happens when leaders abandon moral vision in the name of realism. They survive, and their nations decay. Hope is not naive. Hope is disciplined courage. It is the refusal to accept that brutality is inevitable. It is the decision to build as if tomorrow matters. I speak now beyond Burkina Faso, to the Sahel, scarred by conflict and neglected by conscience. To Africa, tired of being explained but rarely listened to. To the world, watching us through the lens of crisis, do not underestimate the power of moral renewal. Do not assume faith is a private relic. When faith re-enters public conscience, violence loses legitimacy, and despair loses authority. I ask Jesus Christ for mercy and wisdom for Burkina Faso, for protection over our people, clarity for our leaders, and healing for our wounded land. I ask His blessing over Africa, that our continent may rise not through domination, but through dignity. I ask His mercy for myself, because leadership without humility becomes cruelty. This is my final message in this part. If Africa belongs to Christ, then we must choose life every day, not with fear, but with hope, not with silence, but with conscience, not with hatred, but with truth. I want to end this message not with certainty, but with prayerful awareness, because leadership, like faith, is not a destination, it is a daily crossing of fragile ground. I look at the world today and I see nations rich in resources yet poor in meaning. I see power spoken loudly while conscience is whispered. I see leaders praised for efficiency while their people quietly lose hope. This is not only Africa's struggle, it is a human one. To the world watching Africa, I ask you to look again. Do not see us only through conflict maps and aid reports. See us as a people wrestling with the same moral questions that confront every society. What is a human life worth? What is power for? What do we refuse to trade, even when afraid? To my fellow leaders in Africa and beyond, I speak without accusation. We all wake up knowing how easy it is to drift, to delay hard choices, to call silence wisdom, to call compromise realism. Yet history does not remember how well we managed fear. It remembers whether we resisted it. If we place God at the center only when convenient, then God is not at the center at all. If we speak of values only when they cost nothing, then those values are already empty. Faith that never risks discomfort becomes decoration. Leadership that never risks truth becomes administration without soul. I call on leaders to remember why they first felt called to serve, not the ambition, the calling, that moment when power felt like responsibility rather than privilege, that moment when people were faces, not numbers. Return there. That is where conscience still speaks clearly. To Christians, especially those who follow Jesus quietly from afar, I say this. Your faith was never meant to hide forever, not to dominate but to illuminate, not to conquer but to heal. Christ does not ask you to win arguments. He asks you to protect life, tell the truth, and love without fear. To Muslims, I speak with respect and fraternity. We share a belief that God sees injustice, that life is sacred, and that leaders will be judged not only by history but by heaven. Let us not allow extremists or cynics to turn faith into a weapon. Let it remain a compass. To the people of Burkina Faso and to Africa's children, I say this from my heart. You are not forgotten. You are not cursed. You are not born for endless suffering. Your lives matter beyond strategy, beyond headlines, beyond statistics. Never let anyone convince you otherwise. I pray that Jesus Christ bless Burkina Faso with peace that is rooted in justice, not fear. I pray that Africa may rise with dignity, not revenge. I pray for myself that I never confuse power with purpose, and that I never protect my position at the cost of my conscience. If these words resonate with you, stay with this conversation, reflect, speak, share your thoughts. Subscribe not just to a channel, but to the idea that leadership and faith still matter in a broken world. Dialogue, not silence, is how renewal begins. I do not claim victory, I do not claim purity, I claim only responsibility. Each morning I wake up and I must choose again. There is no final triumph, there is only vigilance or surrender.